Hello and welcome to our Letters and Sciences 25 public lecture series on creativity, community, and what connects the two. And I'm very pleased to introduce today a special presentation about the formation of an exhibit. An exhibit is a fundamental way in which we create culture and build community around culture. And I'm really excited to introduce our gallery director at the Birthwriter Art Gallery at UC Berkeley, Gazelle Zamizai. And Gazelle Zamizai is going to take us through a process of describing how three Afghan women who are also with us today, Helena Zeweri, Zelikha Shoja, and Hawa Amin-Arsala, are going to approach the task of putting together an exhibit about the experience of Afghan diasporic memory in the Birthwriter Gallery here at UC Berkeley in the spring. Gazelle Zamizai joins us from a foundational with training in interdisciplinary visual arts at the University of Washington, Seattle, and that's her bachelor's degree, and then her MFA in photography at the University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona. And born in Kabul, Afghanistan, and raised in rural Washington state, Gazelle Zamizai's work often reflects the complexities and contradictions of culture, nationality, and gender through the lens of her bicultural identity. Her work in photography, video, and mixed media has been exhibited across the United States and is about to be exhibited at LACMA in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, in a very prestigious show called Women Defining Women in the Middle East. So very excited about that work, and very excited about your curatorial work here at UC Berkeley, Gazelle. And without further ado, let's welcome Gazelle. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Again, my name is Gazelle Zamizai, and I'm the director of the Birthwriter Art Gallery at UC Berkeley. Thank you to Arts and Design for hosting this conversation, which is related to our forthcoming exhibit, Emergency Afghan Lives Beyond the Forever War. To tell you a little bit about the exhibit is rooted in the idea that art has the power to shed light on today's most pressing social justice issues through documenting and constructing history in ways that touch our deepest emotions. Emergency centers artistic expression from Afghanistan and its global diaspora around the lived experience of 20 years of occupation, displacement, and the disorientation of life in the wake of the US withdrawal in Afghanistan. The exhibit title also reflects the emergent futures that germinate in situations of ongoing crisis that Afghans have been navigating for several decades. While the exhibit highlights Afghan experiences of trauma and suffering, it also moves beyond dominant representations of Afghans as passive suffering victims through focusing on the creative capacity of Afghan people themselves to speak truth to power. More specifically, the exhibit provides the public a window into what it means to live under foreign occupation and the chaos that accompanies its formal end. Emergency aims to foster public awareness of the contradictions of life under empire and in a world of closed borders. In addition to the visual art exhibit that will take place from February 22nd through March 21st of 2023, there will also be a zine of writing titled Writing Afghan Lives Beyond the Forever War, and public programming including a panel discussion. As we talk about archives today, it's helpful to note that the purpose of the zine is to act as a physical artifact. It's an object that will find a home in libraries, bookstores, and literary community centers, thereby allowing the ideas and stories of Afghan creatives to outlive the exhibit itself. Today's speakers are all involved in emergency in one way or another. Moderating the discussion is Helena Zeweri, professor of anthropology and president of the board of the Afghan American Artists and Writers Association, who helped develop the theme of the exhibit. We're also privileged to have Zelikha Shoja and Hawa Amin-Arsala, whose art and writing are featured in the show and zine respectively. I'm really excited for this conversation today because each of these speakers are really brilliant in their own right. So thank you for being here, and take note of any questions you might have. And for now, I will pass it on to Helena. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Thanks so much, Gazelle. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Helena Zeweri, and I was invited to moderate this discussion today. And I wanted to first thank you and Gazelle for organizing this important conversation. I feel really privileged to be with you all today. I'm zooming in from Vancouver, Canada, specifically the University of British Columbia, where I teach in the anthropology department. I want to first acknowledge that UBC sits on the unceded territory of the Musqueam peoples and Coast Salish peoples. And I want to offer this acknowledgement of Indigenous land and at the same time highlight colonization as an ongoing global project of violence that produces various forms of dispossession, displacement, and disconnection from land, culture, and identity. And although I come at the theme for today from the perspective of a cultural anthropologist, through being a part of the Afghan American Artists and Writers Association since 2011, where I work quite a lot with Gazelle, I've come to see the power of the visual arts and writing in decolonizing the worldviews and frameworks that have laid the foundations and sustain settler, colonial, and imperial projects. So I hope to offer a few remarks that situate the importance of this conversation with Zelikha Shoja and Hawa Arsala in this current moment, in a time when the story about the almost 20-year US-NATO war in Afghanistan is quickly being sedimented, calcified in the American public consciousness. Since the August 2021 US military withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Taliban takeover, the Afghan diaspora has been hailed again, especially in the US, as a site of cultural knowledge and expertise that can help the American public reconcile or come to terms with the violence of the withdrawal without having to confront the violence of the war itself and its human collateral, including the 5.3 million Afghans it has displaced and the approximately 47,000 it has killed. And yet again, we're witnessing how in the unfolding tale of the war, a tale which is being narrated as one of noble intentions gone wrong or poorly executed, dehumanizing discourses rear their head yet again, even when they deploy a language of care and compassion. Whether it's liberal feminism's regurgitation of the suffering Afghan woman or humanitarianism's circulation of the figure of the helpless Afghan refugee, the dehumanization of Afghan peoples is alive and well, even in this moment of imperial withdrawal and public reflection on the war. So it's important to have this conversation within, in this case, the virtual halls of the Academy itself, a space that is for producing and circulating the forms of knowledge that have directly and indirectly aided colonial and imperial regimes, and that continue to traffic in Orientalist discourses that dehumanize Afghan people all over the world. But it's also in these kinds of interdisciplinary spaces where art and writing become important tools to rehumanize the Afghan diasporic experience. It is through art and writing that new ways of capturing life outside of and in transgression of inherited colonial genealogies of representation and truth become possible. I have found that it is in these realms that a more radical politics of understanding and narrating diasporic life can germinate. For diasporas themselves are not simply static repositories of cultural knowledge about the homeland. Rather, diasporic peoples embody a fluid subjectivity. They know well how to navigate across multiple cultural epistemologies and worldviews. They are able to connect the experiences of others whose personhood has been shaped by intersecting histories of colonialism and empire with their own. And this lived experience is where the seeds for a radical politics of the archive lie. Archives lie at the heart of knowledge and power. Archives determine what forms of knowledge count as credible and valuable, and whose voice counts as the source of truth and credibility. When it comes to Afghanistan and its global diasporas, the contents of the archive have been overdetermined by colonial and imperial worldviews. In her book, Imagining Afghanistan, historian Nivi Manchanda writes, quote, colonial knowledge has produced Afghanistan as a discursive regime, end quote, around which metaphors, tropes, and other stereotypes cohere to produce Afghanistan as an object of intervention and its people as subhuman. So what does it look like to reclaim the archive, to read it against the grain, to generate what ethnographer Susan Pell has called a radical politics of the archive? For Pell, a radical politics of the archive values the collective generation of knowledge and the preservation, resuscitation, and recognition of collective experiences of life, of grief, hope, pain, joy, and everything in between. So what is the role of art and writing in generating archival practices that rehumanize the Afghan diasporic experience? So the two people whose work we have the privilege of being able to engage with today are, in my view, contributing to this kind of project. So both Zelikha and Hawa's work reveal the many dimensions of diasporic personhood. I'm still learning about their work, but from what I've seen so far, their work examines experiences of loss, memory making, and collective healing on their own terms, refusing to be overdetermined by institutional vocabularies and discourses around identity and culture. Their creative practices, in my view, transgress a politics of essentialized cultural representation. Rather, they strike me as refusals to play into the idea that identities are definitive, anchored, and finished. By centering the power of remembrance, I find Zelikha and Hawa's work as calling on us to embrace the past as an ongoing and enduring force in the present, and as a way to undo the capitalist and colonial compulsion to make the future knowable. While it's important to engage with these works today within the context of Afghan diasporic histories of war and displacement, I also want to point out that their work is so much more than that and cannot be overdetermined by just these concepts. So I see Zelikha and Hawa's work as speaking to larger themes that are not limited to Afghan diasporic experiences, including intergenerational relationships, capitalism, healing, and interdependence in times of precarity. So I'm really grateful for spaces like these where we can explore how to make new worlds and ways of knowing possible through creative arts. And I'm really looking forward to learning from and engaging with Hawa and Zelikha today. And I will turn it over to Hawa John, and I think after the presentations, I'll just ask one or two questions and we'll go from there. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Helena. That was beautiful. And yes, now we're transitioning to Hawa and Zelikha. Okay.
I think I'm scheduled to go next. It's all right, Hawa, I'll go. Thank you, Ghazal, Helena, and Greg for this opportunity. Thank you to my co-panelists, Hawa, and everyone that joined to share the space with us, and greetings from Central New York. Let me screen share something really quickly. In my practice, I often work with family photos, bodies, and repetition and movement to explore the living embodied archive that very much relies on physical touch and performance. Karen Barad, a quantum field theorist, writes, "When two hands touch, there is a sensuality of the flesh, an exchange of warmth, a feeling of pressure, of presence, of a proximity of otherness that brings the other nearly as close as oneself, perhaps closer. So much happens in a touch, an infinity of others, other beings, other spaces, other times are aroused. This idea of touch and alterity is integral to my practice as I explore the ways that memories and histories are embedded in our bodies. This video that's playing right now is Bibi Amir, and Bibi Amir is the name of my maternal grandmother, whose name I learned for the first time in 30 years during this filmmaking process that began during the first peak of the pandemic in spring 2020. Her name was one that my family had difficulty even uttering to me, as it was difficult for them to share and talk about a person that they didn't have a traditional physical archive. So we have no photographs of my grandmother and no physical documents, no birth certificates or citizenship papers. During a period of mass death and loss, they very much felt an urgency to talk about their grandmother for the first time. While I don't have a physical image of my grandmother, I have been told that I bear her resemblance. And I also have access to her living children that you can see here, all 4 of them. This was filmed in Virginia and Maryland. And that is a region that the second largest group of Afghans in diaspora in the US live, with the largest being in the Bay Area. And it's also worth mentioning that that's a community that I was born and raised in Northern Virginia. So my 4 family members became the focal point of this piece to learn about my grandmother. Their skin, corporal memory were integral in channeling and remembering an ancestor that I felt connected to. The recurring plaster body parts that you see throughout this, they were created through a collaborative process where I asked my family members which body parts resemble your grandmother the most, and they made those decisions, and we all together created molds of those body parts. They also interacted with those body parts, which served as another layer of materiality to invoke my grandmother during this process. Here, the body is an archive with accessible memories. We initially tried to recall memories about their mother, but it was challenging for them to share orally, and also they weren't comfortable in front of the camera. They were aware that a public audience would be listening or would watch this in the end, and they didn't want to share anything that was negative or too personal. So I had them establish boundaries throughout this process, which were no faces, and not to translate certain passages that they decided that they don't want to be translated. What was also challenging throughout this process was having the task of translating. It felt like a very heavy burden. So I also made a decision to redact or transliterate certain passages as the English language would fail to describe what they were saying. And I didn't want to include certain cultural context with those translations. The white spaces, they highlight a fragmented sense of absence, and they emphasize that what is being discussed in this private, intimate gathering is not meant to be accessible or digestible for all audiences. Stop it there. The second piece is a series. It's a work in progress called Disduced. It's a close-up of hands and gestures that are printed on organza and cotton textile sheets that are meant to be mirrored and reenacted. They build upon what the writer Diana Taylor calls the repertoire, which, unlike a traditional archive, it doesn't rely on documentation, but ephemeral performance. Afghan society has a very rich storytelling history, and most of my work is, it revolves around communal gatherings and storytelling. And it's also looking at cultural memory and the body to build upon what this repertoire is, which is very liberating, as it allows for folks to remain connected to cultures and ancestors and ultimately refuse dispossession even when we don't have physical objects. So as I'm talking, I'm just going to scroll through these photos, and I invite you all to mirror and reenact the hand gestures that you see in these images. Most of these are copied from like the closest printer my family members could find. So the quality of the images are fairly lo-fi, which is something that I embrace because that is what I have access to. And that's what's the most convenient. And also it adds a certain texture for me. As a neurodivergent person, I instinctively mirror people's gestures on a daily basis. And I found myself doing the same with this collection, especially after the US withdrawal in the summer of 2021. Mirroring became a form of self-soothing, a series of movements and patterns that really focuses on embodiment and the tangible. These hands know how to survive. These are all hands in transient spaces in Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan during the 1980s and 1990s. My body continues a conversation with these static images that my tongue cannot. A recurring approach has been, again, to omit identifiable faces due to privacy and consent, and an utter refusal to give full access to a hypervisible, misrepresented group. And my most recent work is a direct response to the US withdrawal. I was set to shoot my thesis in July and August 2021, which ended up not happening. So in October 2021, I was introduced to a very talented photographer, Hamid Sultani, who I worked with through WhatsApp to film this piece that you see. It's part of a series called The Rehearsal. This one specifically is called We Deliver the Clouds, and it was filmed on a rooftop in Islamabad, Pakistan. Yeah, so Hamid and I worked together through WhatsApp to film this. So we were making the location scouting decisions and the casting decisions just through social media, which was very challenging. And I asked my family members in Kabul to take images of different facades of my maternal home, the home that we've had for 3 generations in Kabul. So again, this is related back to my grandmother. It seems to be like the origin point for a lot of the work that I make. They used their smartphone to take photos, and I enlarged those images in the backdrops that you see here. And I view the backdrops and the space that we're creating here as alternative spaces of transplanting, remembering, and ultimately becoming a home. This domestic space serves as a stage for strangers to become homebodies and to create their own memories in this space. And I will continue to piece together different rehearsals, screen tests, and character and gestural studies across different cities and landscapes using different facades of the house until I have a full picture of what the whole home looks like. And the one here is the rose garden, the backyard of the home. And these improvisational performances, and ultimately my whole practice is about ancestral remembrance and grieving communally as a form of healing. And I've been told that your next assignment is about origin stories. So I want to emphasize to work with any material that you have access to, and that it's never too late to start exploring your origins. And right. Sorry, I can't see the stop share button. Okay. All right, thank you.
You got it. Thank you. That was amazing. I like Gazelle mentioned, I also found it very powerful to mimic the hand gestures in the photos as you were showing them. And it made me feel a lot of feelings that didn't have in a long time because my kids are grown and I remember holding them a certain way. And it's very funny how just seeing the gesture and repeating and mirroring it brought me right back there. So thank you for that. And thank you also for showing the complex process of reconfiguring a space that was no longer accessible to you. And I just had one quick practical question, which was, how did you get those scrolls to be printed or how did the big image scrolls get printed?
Hamid actually printed those backdrops in Pakistan.
They're printed locally. Okay, okay, good.
Yeah,
So,
I sent him the photos and he printed them himself from a local shop.
Amazing, really deep work. And now we thank you, and we're going to go to yet another presentation, which is so rich today and so compelling. And Helena, did you want to introduce Hawa, or do you want to go straight forward?
I think Hawa can start. Yeah, I don't have anything formal prepared, but we can.
So you're all good. I'm going to pin your video to make it all big. It looks great. Welcome. Thank you, Hawa.
Thank you so much, everybody. It's so great to be here. It's such an honor to be with Helena John, Gazelle John, Zelikha John, and Professor Niemeyer and Lisa Wymore. I am a graduate of UC Berkeley, so it's really amazing to be back, not within the fields that I studied, but happily within the arts and design department. And I just want to sort of start with a note of gratitude for the current land that I'm occupying. This is the unceded land of the Nisenan peoples of Sacramento, California, though I was born in DC, raised also in the refugee community of Northern Virginia, and also of the Bay Area and Sacramento here. I'm a transdisciplinary artist, researcher, and writer exploring topics of cultural folklore, benevolent technology, and really utilizing the lens of anthropology and equity to sort of guide my research. But in an institutional sense, I am working as a cultural strategist and creative director. And I will share my screen. Hopefully this looks okay for you all. There might be
Looks great.
Okay, great. So I thought to start with a myriad of messy work. This won't be a linear presentation, so I invite you to get really comfortable, kick off your shoes. And I welcome you all to sort of take notes, screenshots, things like this of the presentation, and just urge you to be mindful of citation when sharing the content. So I think that goes for all artists and work presented, but just making that a note. And beginning with this sort of messy myriad of work, this represents not just what I do, but an attempt to sort of see everything as a form of art, from working with big global fashion brands and publications to emergent technology startups. It's imperative for me to be socially engaged through art, to be in search of the right questions as a strategist, which the field of strategy is sort of a military technology. And so I think it's really interesting how I've found my way to that sort of specific field in an institutional sense as a daughter of war refugees. As a creative director, I believe in the gravity of collective storytelling, visual language, and spoken word to shift consciousness. And in this work, I hope to provide answers to the questions that are strategically created through my work as a strategist. And I will say that as a strategist, this work is mostly done in the capacity of what I lovingly consider a con artist. So there are times where I introduce myself as a con artist, but sometimes that might be manifest in how I approach certain cultural research projects or studies, things like that. On this page, you'll see everything from my collage work to photography to big global campaigns, drawings, photography from Afghanistan from when I first went there in 2008. An image of my mother that is more so in the emergent space, but I sort of want to illustrate how I arrived at this thought of con artistry. In my last corporate role, I had an inside view into what I consider the futures industry. During that time, I was thinking heavily about the interconnectedness of past, present, future, making notes such as this, looking at the industry of presence, the ways that we look at memory regression, amnesiatic progress, and just to sort of double click into this idea of the futures industry, I thought I'd share a few examples that come from companies, institutions, laboratories that are really looking at cultural trends and developing future forecasting. And so what they do throughout these sort of companies and agencies and things like this is literally construct the future through the plastic scaffolding of capitalism. They usher in ideas of progress through data-backed insights. However, working in this realm for about 4+ years, both as a culture creator and a culture hunter, I saw how easily data could be interpreted or manipulated to sell brands on narrow visions of the future. And so this progress becomes a perpetual gaze toward a better tomorrow, which I feel is an art form at best, an art form that perpetuates cultural amnesia through rebranded trend cycles. Greenwashing becomes woke-washing, activism becomes impact, celebrity becomes influencer, and on. So I want to sort of point to
May I make a comment? I was so in awe of your artwork that I thought that the gray boxes were actually part of the design, but I think it's part of the Zoom interface, and there's your menu bars covering up some of the slide, and we can't actually see the slide. So if you move the menu bars around or minimize them, then we'll see more of the slide.
all right, let's see.
And it's a perennial problem. Yeah, now I think that's your chat box or something. And if you just make those things go away or minimize them to the side, then it'll be okay.
Okay,
Perfect. Thank you so much. Because
this is as good as it can get, but
this is good. Yeah. This is good, yeah.
okay, great. So I'm just going to sort of turn our attention towards the McKinsey quarterly example. McKinsey usually has these hopeful looks to the future, but oftentimes these are overshadowed by their management of different crises, such as Puerto Rico's bankruptcy, where the firm's contracts footed by the island's taxpayers totaled to $3.3 million a month, and these were paid by Puerto Rican taxpayers. And so there's this sort of crisis of consciousness that I feel that's within the futures industry, and where this sort of con that is created is that the future can be sculpted, stamped, branded, and sold to the highest bidder. So if we're talking about art forms, in my opinion, these industries breed con artists. And so I lean into this notion when playing with my art practice. I'll briefly talk about Brown Tirage, which was about a decade in the making, that I lovingly started with a fellow Berkeley student, Tanya Biglari, in 2010, and a host of other collaborators and contributors. It started as a joke, but we basically developed this archive over the decade around ideas of representation and a life cycle centered on the conscious consumption and production of culture. This specific project you see here on the right is called Subalternate Realities, as part of Morishine Alayari and Daniel Rourke's 3D additivist manifesto on the speculative realities of the emergent technology of 3D printing at the time. We intended to tell a history from below, which is an important element to how I view collaborative storytelling. Next is reality streaming. This started a couple years ago. It's a newsletter and art bot project that explores the relationship between technology, spirituality, and power. Some of these are musings and others are collaborations with other artists sprinkled throughout an anti-editorialized stream of subconsciousness. And I began this as I was sort of transitioning out of my more corporate work to just understand what binge watching the illusion truly means in the era of streaming and binge watching. And so I'll read from a few excerpts. The first is The Autumn of Capitalism. American capitalism is not invested in end. It is invested in accelerated repetition. It manufactures end, it plays into seasonality, but it does not want itself, its empire, its hegemonic reign to end. hence expansion, hence inclusion. This is crisis capitalism forever. This is chronic capitalism. The uncanny recurrence of this pathology has been foretold, is being told, is undergoing its next set of theories and stories. For this story, we are calling beyond the paradigm, summoning a fifth season to be our guide. If capitalism conditions us to prepare for a future that hasn't come yet, then we ask that the best possible future meet us in the fifth dimension. We ask the anomaly, how do you arise when the conditions are not in your favor? We normalize the glitch, deja vu, etc., to bring uncanny awareness to our own masks, illusions, conceptions of real and right. The poetics of mass construction. In the years surrounding 9/11, I rallied to get my Spanish teacher fired for consistently making lewd and sexual comments towards students in the class. I shared a house with another family. I learned how to steal yogurt cups from the nurse's station while my father got chemo. I watched my mother become a widow while my sister and I had secret spiritual awakenings. We shared a house with another family, again, and I became a terrorist in the eyes of my peers. Before that day, those kids didn't believe Afghanistan was a real place. I erased myself until I became legible as a patriot. I dropped part of my last name so I couldn't be traced to a family in Afghanistan's new regime. I changed my first name at my new high school. For 4 years, I was Hawa Arsala at roll call. I dropped my Islam from public view too. I dropped it so hard, it shattered into a million disparate belief systems. Wintering of the soul. For a month, I stayed in the room I was living in when 9/11 happened, portaling into long forgotten memories of lockdowns and keeping cool walking past tinted SUVs in the neighborhood. In 2021, though, one of the two aunts who lives there is floating in the memory loops of dementia. Even when she forgets who I am, she readily treats me like family. That's how we were raised. It feels like a blessing that she doesn't remember too much. I call a dear friend to let him know I'm on to the next leg of travels, and the first thing he says is, "You're really swimming in the DNA over there, huh?" I didn't mean to, it kind of just happened. So those are some musings that I have on the reality streaming newsletter. They've happened over the course of the last year, and I just wanted to share that there was a lot of deep familial archival work. And in my parallel practice with writing these, I also practice something called the Akashic Records, reading the Akashic Records. And this is an etheric archive in which I'm working on ancestral remembrance and repair, and also sort of developing a new language around family. And so a dear friend of mine, Mariam Kayoum, and I decided to create a bot baby, Aris, who basically is fed all of my writing from reality streaming and any other avenues in which I'm writing in, and sort of tweets out information. And if you have Telegram and you hold your phone camera up to the QR code, you can actually have a conversation with Aris. But I decided to share a few screenshots. One, me checking in on Aris if Aris was ready for today's presentation, and a few choice tweets that oftentimes feel way more poetic than my own writing. And so it's really beautiful for us to both be feeding this child together as two diasporic Afghans in different parts of the country, but also see the potential for AI to evoke organic qualities and humanistic qualities. A year ago, I decided to take a sabbatical to develop my own sense of research and training. I walked away from corporate work and decided to look at decentralized learning programs. The first that I was involved in was a spiritual ecology leadership program wherein I wrote, beginning that program, I was a month into resignation when our first week in class started. I was in the fall of my career, the fall of my homeland, the falling of time into pieces, the falling of spirit into a cave, the simmering of bones in the marrow of a dying culture. I could not and cannot leave this space without the right questions. In that fracture of chronologies where we witnessed a cascading of global tragedies and continue to today, I ask, why is it that we are caught in these time loops, these doldrums wherein atrocities repeat themselves? And so my work, while being very representation focused for a while, sort of went through this prism, this dissolution of the self, and really sort of taking myself out of institutions, paradigms, living with my mother, developing a new sort of language with family and ancestral trauma and all these sorts of things, and really looking at the way forward through this lens of regeneration, really thinking about, do we need more ideas in the world, or do we just need more people to adopt better ideas? And so this is just on the right, some emergent work. I think it's really awesome to be able to be in conversation with Zelikha John, because in the disembodiment of pulling myself out of a certain reality and dissolving of the identity, I felt this lack of embodiment and really looked to my hand as a gesture for pulling me into new languages. I was also a part of a climate fellowship where we were able to speak to different tribal elders, Dene elders, and this language of spending the night in jail defending the earth as a badge of honor really revealed the ways in which I'm looking towards not just regeneration, but land-based wisdom and practices throughout my photography, writing, drawing going forward. And really looking at the map of this program and realizing that the Rio Grande and San Juan watersheds map was really looking similar to Afghanistan, in the shape of Afghanistan, and it being a very intentional reason that I was interested in studying in the Southwest. On the left, you'll see an image of an anti-terrorist training camp in New Mexico, and just thinking about if, you know, people can be studying how to fight terrorism in my home country, where terrorism was not a thing for the longest time. How can we use land and building language through land in order to develop new realities? And so this concept of emergence preparedness came through that program. And this was outside of knowing what the topic for next year's show would be. And so it was really beautiful to see that we aren't just operating in silos, we are thinking collectively. There is a consciousness, especially an Afghan consciousness and a diasporic consciousness that we're all tapping into in these sort of psychic and etheric environments. And this is sort of where I'm at right now in terms of developing this language with the land. These are all field drawings, and I have to say thank you to the peoples of the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, the Jicarilla Apache, Navajo, and Hopi for allowing us to travel through their lands and sort of develop this language and this conversation and dialogue. And to sort of bring us out, Zange Sulh is a poem. It's an ode to entering this fierceness of ever-present change, and those who have surrendered to ever-present change, studied it, expanded their flux capacity. These are the ones who must non sequitur us forward. And I use that phrase because I personally feel most free when I don't make logical sense or sequence. Shout out to the neurodivergent people. And perhaps it's that I can't be coded by the hegemonic paradigm very easily. It's not about being absurd as much as it is a radical evasion. So these are just some final thoughts and some images of me as a 4-year-old painting and as a modern dancer to show that, you know, I am Afghan, but I'm also American. There is a lexicon here that expands beyond what we've shared today. And I appreciate Helena John for pointing that out. But these are some things that I sort of stand by in my practice, and I will leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you. That was an amazing set of presentations, and I can't wait to see the show coming up. So Gazelle, back to you for questions, and then I want to remind everybody that we have a Q&A button where you can post questions that we will then ask for you, where we can also unmute you if you want to ask your question in person. And so we're looking forward to contributions to the Q&A, but in the meantime, I'm going to pass it on to Gazelle. Or Helena, okay, sorry. Helena is going to be asking questions. Yeah.
Thanks, Greg. No worries. Yeah, I have one question for each of you because I know time is limited, but I just wanted to thank you both for your presentations, and the work really gets me to think about the themes of remembrance and future making and resisting the instrumentalization of culture in different ways. So I guess I'll just ask a question to Zelikha John first. Thank you for sharing your work at BBME. It was really, really interesting. And I guess I just wanted to hear more about how your use of the body as an archive kind of contributes to this idea of ancestral remembrance. And alongside that, you mentioned, and I think Greg also mentioned it in the chat, like the right to opacity, which I think is really, really thought-provoking, especially given that Afghanistan is this place, and the diaspora too, that is both hyper visible and invisible at the same time to kind of the public imagination. And I think opacity can be a powerful way of kind of resisting the impetus to instrumentalize cultural knowledge. So I'd just be curious to hear more about how opacity plays a role in your conceptualization of the body as an archive, and in relation to ancestral remembrance, if that makes sense. But feel free to take it wherever works for you.
I had a lot of trouble when I was making Bibi Amir, because I'm working with a very private community who's also aware that I'm going to be sharing this. And then I was like, should I be sharing this? And if I do, what should I not include in it? In grad school, I was really surprised to be told the same thing that I was told in like high school or undergrad, which is that it's my responsibility or my job to prove my humanity to people. And like, I just completely refused that. So I was aware that anything that I make would become like the gaze that was on the work was just really intense. Yeah, Greg, like I still get this in grad school. It's like my job to make an ethnographic educational experience, and that for specifically people in the West. So when I made the decision to not translate certain things, I got pushback from an older professor who told me that he doesn't understand what is being said, and addressed how it wasn't accessible. And I also pushed back and was like, well, it's not for you. And I make work for my community, about my community, and specifically the microcosm of my family, because I hold myself responsible and accountable for them, and I can communicate with them. I don't want to speak for a large group of people who are used to being spoken for, and then have that like be digested by a Western audience. That's like a horrific thing to do. So I don't want to translate certain things or any of the work. And I think you had like 3 questions in one. So besides the right of opacity, what was the other question?
Sorry, yeah.
Or did I answer it? Sorry.
No worries. It was a very kind of convoluted question, but yeah, just kind of the role of the body as an archive, or how you think about the body as an archive and its connection to ancestral remembrance, specifically in BBME or maybe in other pieces that you've done as well.
When I first started BBME, I was thinking like in a very Western linear way of like acquiring knowledge, where I wanted like the history of my grandmother, or like to be able to chronicle her life, or what were her dreams. Like I was thinking a very a way that was really hindering the whole process. And I realized I'm so fortunate to have access to all 4 of her children in the US. I have access to these people that are able to that were really struggling to talk about their grandmother. They were policing each other. If they were in a group and they wanted to share a memory, they would talk over each other, like, no, this is what happened. And so they would be uncomfortable to even share, because they know they have the responsibility to share something about someone who's deceased, and they don't want to say anything negative. And that's also a cultural thing where we don't speak ill of the dead. So they would say things that were very impersonal, like everything boiled down to the labor my grandmother performed. She cooked food well, she took care of us, we have no complaints. And it was very impersonal. And then I realized also that her life was silent while she was still alive too, because she couldn't express anything to her children. And I want to, now that I know her name, I want to keep repeating it and make sure that she's not silent or she's not forgotten. And moving the body in the way that they were some of the gestures they were doing, or some of the plaster molds they have. I was also using the plaster molds to do performances by the water. And that was my way of invoking her memory or feeling close to her with those body parts or some kind of physical manifestation. Oh, see questions. Right.
Thanks for sharing that, Zelikha. I'll just ask one question to Hawa John, and then I guess we can move to Q&A from others because I know they're coming in. So I would be interested to hear more about how Hawa, you're navigating the demands to kind of instrumentalize knowledge about Afghan identity that is so like pervasive in the corporate world. I mean, there's like a whole military knowledge industrial complex that exists around Afghanistan and also the Afghan diaspora. So I just want to know more about what is it like to kind of be in the corporate world, you know, navigating the commodification of knowledge, but also doing what you're doing, which is engaging in this radical critique of capitalist structures. And you use the phrase radical evasion. So maybe thinking more about like, what does it mean to radically evade these structures through your writing and through your art, while at the same time, you know, working in these corporate spaces. Yeah, and since you're you identify as a cultural anthropologist, you have the ability to make the familiar strange and like exoticize these corporate worlds. So I just want to hear more. Yeah.
That is a beautiful question, Helena John. You know, just as you were speaking, I was thinking about, you know, I guess my lifelong practice, but also over the past couple of years, just really going into the family archives and sort of recounting my physical presence in Afghanistan and how much land actually speaks to me, and that language, and thinking of sort of these historical tropes of like, you know, where empires go to die and things like this, and these sort of phrases where I, as a queer person, I want to queer these ideas of how our country is seen, how we are sort of identified. And I think radical evasion is kind of this idea of going into the mountains of my own ideas, my own writing and theorizing, I guess, that allows me to sort of have these hiding spots and you know, create the grounds for people to maybe, you know, some people get lost in my writing, and I acknowledge that. Sometimes it can be a lot of information at once, and I think there is a really critical role that not being traced, especially having grown up as an Afghan American Muslim person post 9/11, is a significant part of just how I view the way I operate within institutions, and then outside of those spaces to really be as vocal as possible through my own very careful and diligent process to make these sort of promises. And emergence preparedness is not an idea of which I have a lot of ideas, but it is a promise to go back to Afghanistan and create something on the land and on the ground. And I think promises can oftentimes be seen as threats. And so radical evasion is sort of, you know, being in that liminal space between, you know, a hopeful promise and what could be perceived as a threat. You know, as an Afghan American, as both a daughter of refugees and a settler, I think being in this in-between space almost creates this disappearing act that has maybe a sort of power embedded into it. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for that answer. That was really powerful. So many great phrases there, being traced. I really appreciate that. Maybe I'll turn it over. Thank you both. Maybe I'll turn it over to Greg, who can field the other questions.
Yes, I'm ready with 3 questions from the audience, and there's already a bit of a meme for some reason. And the questions are all to both Z and H, and which is of course Zelikha and Hawa, and turned into Z and H, which I thought was kind of funny. But anyways, so all 3 questions are for both of you, and the first one is difficult, and it reminds me of how you, Hawa, described your experience with the consequences of 9/11, and but it's kind of the reverse of that. And the question is, do you ever experience a kind of imposter syndrome, like you don't feel Afghan enough to be representing your culture in your art in America?
You can go first, Hawa, if you'd like.
Okay. I feel imposter syndrome over so many things. And I think being Afghan is just one of the various things. I've felt imposter syndrome over calling myself an artist, over calling myself a strategist, any sort of thing. And I think over the course of my life, now being in the middle of my 30s, I'm really seeing the power of just, sort of claiming certain things. And I think, of course, there has been a struggle of not being Afghan enough, of the guilt and shame that comes with the privileged life of my family having escaped Afghanistan and growing up in an American context. And yet within the American context, there's a whole different set of privileges. And so I think, yes, there is a not enoughness that comes up when it comes to my Afghan identity. People who think that if you didn't go back to Afghanistan once you reached a certain critical point in your career, then you're a traitor or you've abandoned your country. And I think as a woman, it's very specifically challenging with Afghan identity, because I think oftentimes it gets convoluted with a sort of religious overtone that is oftentimes imposed on Afghan women. And so I think just to call myself an Afghan or Afghan American artist is itself super transgressive. And I think that imposter syndrome is quelled by just, nobody's perfect. Identity is amorphous. And I think I just give myself that allowance.
Yes, that's a powerful answer. Let's give ourselves the allowance. And Zelikha, any ideas there?
I feel almost identical as to what you said. For me, the imposter syndrome is like the place I feel it the most is with also religion. I finally feel comfortable enough not identifying as Muslim. But when I'm within Afghan communities, I don't feel comfortable saying that out loud, or also related to another question, speaking about being neurodivergent, because there's a lot of policing or hostility. And it's something that I don't want to confront in certain communities or certain environments where I just don't feel safe. But I think after 9/11, I felt the imposter syndrome the most, because I would have a lot of questions about religion, or having this weight again of people asking you certain questions about histories that you might not understand, or oftentimes I get asked, oh, what is your last name? And then somebody tries to trace your family, or thinks about a specific town or village you're from, and you tell them that, they're like, oh, I'm from Panjshir. And so I get questions about the genocide that's occurring there, and or do you know people that are specifically affected? And because I don't have a tangible connection with certain people sometimes dismiss you, that you're not Afghan enough. And I think I've been a lot more generous and kind with myself over the years, where I don't internalize that as much. But I feel imposter syndrome with everything else almost daily.
Okay, well, I'm going to take your answers and connect it to the next question, which is, you did mention neurodiversity, and there was a question there. What role does neurodiversity play in your work life art? Does it bring its own form of inspiration and challenges?
There are a lot of challenges, like not being able to have that conversation with your community where people need to be having that conversation. That's the challenge. Inspiration. I think I've struggled for a long time with the way I think and my art practice, and just things being all over the place, sometimes not being practical. And when I finally realized, like, this is my process, or like I need to rework certain things, it came to accepting the way I think and having to, I realized I have a hard time taking care of myself alone. So that opened me up, and I've been able to collaborate with people more and accept that I can't do certain things alone, and that's totally fine. And that actually, coming to that realization was during the pandemic, or losing access to communicating with people or being in certain spaces. So that's the one great thing that came out of the pandemic for me. It's self-acceptance and really trusting my process and learning to collaborate with people a lot better.
Thank you. Hawa?
Yeah, I think for me, there was a sense of loss, I think, around understanding that I'm dyslexic in certain ways, that I process information differently, that I oftentimes start at an end and have to re-engineer myself to a beginning, and sort of thinking about how rhizomatic my thought process is around certain things, and the challenges in communication that arise, whether that is with collaborators, a boss, or something else, and the sense of loss being, oh, I wish I understood this about myself sooner, or I wish this was something that my family, my parents were able to understand was a thing, that now my mother as a translator is seeing young refugee children that express this, and she is then able to see, oh, I think my daughter might have had this too. And so I think there has been a grief around it, but it has also allowed me to just lean into that rhizomatic web and allow my writing to live in that way, because it might just speak to people who, the minority of people who might be living and thinking in that web-like way, which to me feels much more authentic than trying to rigidly write something into forms that are socially and through the writing world acceptable.
I'm on mute. I like that term, web-like, and I also like the stories here about the impact your descriptions about your own experiences have on others. And so that connects with the next question, which is coming from Denise Dengi, which is, what has been the most meaningful interaction you've gained from presenting your stories?
When I showed Bibi Amir to my family, at first they really didn't want to see themselves on camera. But when they all sat together and saw the work, they were laughing. They were laughing a lot more than I expected them to, especially in moments where they were recounting stories that were really horrific about war. But just seeing themselves on the screen, they were laughing, and like I saw all of my aunts and uncles like essentially turn into children around each other, and that was really touching. The way they move their bodies on a daily basis, like very rigid. And then during that process of making BBM, having them open up and again laugh, play with each other was just amazing. And also one of the first installations I did for Bibi Hamid, I had a plate of dried nuts, berries, things that you traditionally put on a plate and give to guests when they come visit you. And I had that out and asked people to make little remembrance sculptures of someone they wanted to remember in that moment while watching Bibi Hamid. And I saw a mother and her 5-year-old daughter use the mulberries, the toot, to make a shape of a body. And I saw them vaguely, but I didn't realize they were the ones that made the sculpture. And when I posted on Instagram, somehow that mother found me and was like, oh, I made this. Thank you for that opportunity. I introduced my grandmother to my 5-year-old daughter. And that was really touching for me.
Wow. So you gave people a way to express themselves and by taking your position. And that also is a beautiful story. You definitely know you're not an imposter if you make people laugh, you know. If you get that those kinds of reactions, you know you're doing the real thing, the real work. And back to you, Hawa. Any impacts from your sharing your work?
I'm reminded of something recently that happened this summer in June. I was traveling throughout the Southwest for this climate fellowship, and at one point I was talking to a young Navajo biologist on the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation, and we were doing a service project, us and the other fellows, and I was telling him about being an Afghan and some of our stories and the ways in which we greet each other and things like this. And there was just an affinity between us, and he had said something about, oh, what's happening to you guys is what's happened to us. And in my final project, after I presented, another person that was a part of this fellowship was Dene Navajo storyteller elder Sunny, who is an amazing person, a wealth of wisdom. And after I finished my presentation on sort of my strategies and the way that I view landscapes and things like this, she said it was how she thinks, how her culture thinks. And so I think what was so provocative for me, while, you know, this might not be everybody's shared idea, but between those two stories, to feel that my family, that my tribe and clan could expand beyond just the geography of Afghanistan and into other sort of clans and families was just this beautiful mirror at a time where mirrors tend to like show the dark sides of ourselves and our souls. And so that felt like a hopeful potential to me as a Berkeley student studying the Third World Liberation Front and really centering transnational movement building through my art, writing, and thinking, to be able to build bridges, to be able to build love with each other through stories, feels very beautiful and powerful.
Yeah, you also substantiated that in your work by bringing those two maps together in an animation. And that kind of overlay I found very powerful. We'll have to compare notes on that. Done work like that too. And so there's one more question that I'd like you to answer super briefly. It's kind of an unusual question, but it says something maybe more about the question asker than about you. But then I'd like to give the word back to Gazelle and Helena, who really brought us a wonderful panel today. So just quickly, do you think your work career path would have been different if you had grown up in Afghanistan instead of America?
I try not to think about that question too much because I mean, I think I did internalize a lot when I was younger, where I felt survivor's guilt. And I looked at my mother and felt guilty that she, along with a lot of other women, were forced to choose a path of becoming a wife and a mother. And I feel incredibly grateful and collaborate with her often because I feel very fortunate to be able to choose my own path and be able to express myself. I think for a very long time when I had a lot of survivor's guilt, I was disassociating a lot, which is why embodiment and touch are really integral in my practice, because it's been extremely therapeutic. But I don't know what my life would be like if I had grown up in Afghanistan. Probably very different from where I am right now. But yeah, being born and raised in this culture or in this country is definitely, it's a blessing in a lot of ways.
Thank you. And Hawa?
Yeah, I think Zelikha John brings up a really great point because I guess as I'm racking my brain, it would almost feel disrespectful to think about what my life would be like had I grown up in Afghanistan, because it's just, yeah, I can't think about that. I can only think about this sort of cross-cultural connection and how being an Afghan in America, growing up like with American culture, going to an Incubus concert as my first concert. I do think that there is a beautiful potential to be within the country that has orchestrated so much harm in my country, and to learn from these strategies and be able to contribute whatever way possible to the liberation of my people.
I couldn't imagine a better way to end this conversation. Thank you so much. Let's give you a round of applause. And I'm going to give the word back to Gazelle or Helena to bring us all back together. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel.
Thank you, everyone. That was really amazing. And as an Afghan American creative myself, you gave me personally so much to think about. So thank you. And makes me even more excited about the exhibit in the spring. I put in the chat for any of the audience members, if you'd like to receive updates on the forthcoming exhibit, you can send us an email to sign up for our newsletter or follow us on Instagram. And Helena, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything.
Just wanted to echo my gratitude to John, Zelikha John, for their incredible insights, and thanks to Greg and Lisa for organizing this and facilitating this conversation. And I have so many other questions for you both, so we can continue this conversation in another way.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for this incredible panel today.
All right.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Greg, Helena, Gazal, Hawa.
Thank you, everyone.
Looking forward to the next show, and we'll follow up on many levels and share with you maybe some of the origin stories that come out of this conversation.
That'd be great.
Please.
Bye.
Bye.